Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing big summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, so imagine walking into a beautiful historic church building. You are, seeking a quiet moment of reflection, perhaps some spiritual guidance.
Right, a sanctuary.
Exactly. You open the heavy oak doors, step into the sanctuary, and you look toward the beautifully carved wooden platform. But instead of a pulpit or a choir, the entire front of the church is just buried under these massive, towering stacks of burlap sacks filled with potatoes.
Just completely overrun with groceries.
Yes. And when you ask the staff how they manage to, actually hold their services, they look at you exhausted and reply, well, we don't have time to conduct meetings anymore. We are too busy feeding people.
It's such a striking visual.
It really is.
Yeah.
And today, we are opening up a document from 1954 that explains exactly why that potato-filled church was ultimately doomed to close its doors forever.
Yeah, it's a fascinating piece of history.
We are taking a deep dive into A Study of Rescue Missions by Reverend William Seath. It's a text that serves as this incredible foundational blueprint for understanding how cities handle their most vulnerable populations.
And that potato sack story, it is one of the most striking cautionary tales in this entire study. It perfectly sets up the tension we are going to explore today.
Yeah, definitely.
But to understand the weight of that warning, we really have to look at the man who issued it. Dr. William Seath was not, some academic observing from an ivory tower.
Right. He was actually out there doing the work.
Exactly. Yeah. By the time he published this study in 1954, he had been deep in the trenches of urban mission work for over 3 decades.
Wow, 30 years.
Yeah, he began back in 1920 as the associate superintendent of the Union City Mission in Minneapolis. And then he spent decades as the executive director of the Chicago Christian Industrial League.
So he really knew the sights, the smells, the agonizing complexities of urban poverty firsthand.
He absolutely did, and he wrote this document to serve as a comprehensive manual. He's outlining the philosophy, the history, and the highly specific operational mechanics of the mid-20th century rescue mission.
And for you, our listener, whether your background is in urban ministry, maybe secular social work, or you are simply trying to understand the complex history of how society treats those on the absolute margins, this deep dive is going to take you directly into the operational mindset of 1954.
It's basically a shortcut to understanding the roots of urban rescue missions.
For sure. We are going to unpack the sociological mechanisms of Skid Row, examine some surprisingly modern psychological approaches to counseling, and look at the exact methods used to rehabilitate those who are considered the least, the last, and the lost.
But, to do that accurately, we really have to view this through the proper historical lens.
That is a crucial point. We need to set the ground rules for how we're approaching this text.
Right. As we analyze Seath's operational methods, it is vital to understand his underlying operating system. This document is fundamentally anchored in 1950s Christian evangelical theology.
Yeah, very deeply rooted in that worldview.
His proposed solutions for urban poverty are inextricably linked to concepts of sin, spiritual salvation, and the transformative power of a personal relationship with Christ. He is also highly critical of the limitations of purely secular government agencies.
Right, and we should explicitly state to you, the listener, that we are analyzing this document impartially. We are not endorsing or taking sides on these religious or political viewpoints.
Exactly. We are just here to accurately report the historical and theological mechanisms exactly as Seath designed them. Understanding his theological worldview is, it's essential to understanding why he structured these missions the way he did.
So setting the stage, before we look at the blueprints of the buildings or the logistics of the soup kitchens, we have to understand the human element. Who exactly were these missions serving?
And Seath answers this by opening his study not with demographic data, which you might expect, but with a piece of poetry.
I love this part. He quotes Robert Service's poem, The Men That Don't Fit In. The opening lines are just incredibly evocative. Let me read them. There's a race of men that don't fit in, a race that can't stay still. So they break the hearts of kith and kin, and they roam the world at will.
It's powerful stuff. Service continues by describing a population driven by gypsy blood, people who range the field and rove the flood. They just possess a constitution that simply does not know how to rest.
Yeah, he argues that many of these individuals are strong, brave, and true.
Right.
Capable of going far if they just walked a straight line.
But they don't. They are constitutionally tired of the status quo. They constantly crave the strange and the new, which inevitably pushes them to the fringes of a structured society.
And Seath uses this poem to establish a profound baseline. He is dealing with a timeless human phenomenon, not just a localized 1950s aberration.
Right.
Reading that poem in the context of a 1954 clinical study, it honestly stopped me in my tracks. It feels like an early, almost romanticized way of trying to articulate concepts that today we might frame around neurodivergence.
Oh, that's a really interesting way to look at it.
Or perhaps, the deep psychological trauma that leads to systemic displacement. It acknowledges that there's a subset of humanity that is just wired differently.
And mainstream society, especially the rigidly structured post-war 9-to-5 society of 1950s America, it requires a very specific conformity.
Exactly. When people cannot fit that mold, society just doesn't know what to do with them, so they are pushed into the shadows.
And Seath recognizes that displacement. He immediately zooms out to prove that this is not a modern American invention. He actually traces the lineage of the dispossessed back through antiquity.
Right, he goes way back.
He points out that dealing with the unfortunate, the transient, and the handicapped is a puzzle that has challenged every major civilization. He starts in the ancient world, specifically ancient Rome.
Yes. Runaway slaves and displaced workers.
Exactly. During the Roman Empire, agricultural consolidation pushed people off land, and slavery created massive societal shifts. So these runaway slaves and displaced workers flooded into the incredibly crowded quarters of larger cities. Rome basically became a sprawling mecca for vagrants seeking anonymity.
Just trying to get the scraps of a massive urban center. He also looks eastward, noting the long historical presence of wandering minstrels, roving monks, fakirs, and beggars in the Orient.
Right, entire subcultures of people who moved continuously, relying entirely on the alms of the settled population.
And then moving into early European history, he highlights the role of the monasteries. Before the advent of state-sponsored welfare, that sprawling network of monasteries provided really the only reliable refuge for the vagrant and the destitute.
But the critical through line in all these historical examples, at least according to Seath, is the lack of a systemic rehabilitative goal.
They were just giving them a place to sleep for a night.
Right. Whether it was a runaway slave in Rome or a wandering beggar in medieval Europe, they were largely left to the sporadic charity of passersby or the temporary hospitality of monks. There was no organized, clinical effort to actually solve the root cause of their wandering.
Or to reintegrate them into the social fabric. It was survival, not rehabilitation.
Exactly.
Which makes the transition to the American context so fascinating to me. The American genesis of the rescue mission movement wasn't just about handing out bread. It was about building systemic infrastructure.
Yeah, it was a totally different approach.
And there is a historical fact in this text regarding that infrastructure that completely blew my mind. Seath quotes Dr. W.E. Paul to point out that the massive public school system in Cleveland, Ohio, actually traces its roots back to the 1830s.
That's such a wild detail.
I know. Specifically, it traces back to little makeshift schools organized by an outfit called the Western Seamen's Friends Society.
And the socioeconomic context of the 1830s Great Lakes region makes this incredibly logical when you really break it down.
Right, because of the maritime economy.
Exactly. You had this booming economy, and the ports were flooded with highly transient, rough-and-tumble sailors moving cargo. These men, and often their families, lived completely outside the settled norms of a growing city like Cleveland.
The traditional established churches and schools just were not equipped to handle this rugged, transient population.
They weren't. So the Western Seamen's Friends Society stepped in to fill the void. They created grassroots Sunday schools and basic grade schools specifically for the children of the waterfront.
And over time, that localized rescue infrastructure proved so vital that it evolved and was completely absorbed into what became the city's formal public education system.
It is a perfect illustration of how grassroots urban missions often function as the beta testers for municipal infrastructure.
Totally. Moving along the timeline, Seath marks the formal beginning of the rescue mission movement in America with the Jerry McAuley mission, which was founded in New York in 1872.
And think about New York in 1872. The Gilded Age, massive industrialization, staggering wealth inequality.
Plus, a huge influx of immigrants living in brutal tenement conditions.
Exactly. Macaulay's mission was ground zero for addressing that fallout. And the very next year, in 1873, you see the Bethel mission established in Duluth, Minnesota.
which was another major port city dealing with transient labor.
Right. Now, the nomenclature of the movement also carries profound historical weight. The specific term rescue mission appears to have been codified around 1888 in Syracuse, New York.
By a man named H.B. Gibbon, right?
Yes, and what makes Gibbon's choice of words so significant is his background. Prior to opening this urban mission, he had been deeply involved in operating safe houses on the Underground Railroad, sheltering runaway slaves.
Wow. The metaphorical shift there is incredibly powerful. He took the operational vocabulary of the Underground Railroad, places previously called rescue bands or places of refuge, and applied it directly to urban poverty.
He essentially recognized a different form of bondage. He shifted from rescuing people from the literal, legal bondage of chattel slavery to rescuing them from the sociological and psychological bondage of addiction, crushing poverty, and urban destitution.
The methodology of providing a safe harbor remained the same, even as the nature of the chains had changed.
Exactly. And the success of these early efforts in New York and Minnesota proved the model, and the Great Rescue Mission movement began to proliferate across American cities.
So now that we understand the historical lineage of the dispossessed and the origins of the movement, we need to examine the specific ecosystem these missions were operating within during the mid-20th century. We have to talk about the concept of Skid Row.
Skid Row, yes.
How does a sociologist or a mission director in 1954 define Skid Row?
Well, Seath approaches the definition both geographically and psychologically. Geographically, he defines Skid Row as a comparatively small, highly concentrated area found in most larger cities.
Okay, so a specific physical location.
Right. It serves as the primary gathering place for homeless, unemployed, transient, and handicapped individuals. And he paints a gritty, unvarnished picture of this ecosystem.
Lots of cheap taverns and flop houses, I imagine.
Exactly. It's a densely packed corridor of human dereliction, dominated by those taverns, dilapidated lodging houses, cut-rate diners, pawn shops, and day labor employment agencies. To him, it is the ultimate destination for the least, the last, and the lost.
But, the physical description of the taverns and flop houses isn't the most important part of his analysis. Seath makes a deeply structural argument about the nature of Skid Row that pushes back hard against the prevailing 1950s narrative.
Yes, the narrative of rugged individualism and personal moral failure.
Right. He argues vehemently that the men do not make Skid Row what it is. He writes, if the buildings on Skid Row were cleaned up and made decent places, the men who frequent them would meet the higher standards.
That is a staggering sociological claim for 1954.
It really is.
He is presenting an environmental theory of degradation. He argues that Skid Row functions like a gravitational black hole. It pulls men down.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the environment itself, often dictated by economic circumstances far beyond the individual's control, forces these men to accept the absolute lowest standards of living that the broader municipality is willing to tolerate.
So the trap is the geography and the built environment, not just the weakness of the men within it.
Precisely. It flips the script entirely. It's not the moral failure of the transient worker that creates the slum. It is the deliberate neglect of the slum that degrades the worker.
That's a powerful distinction. And to support this, Seath dives into empirical data. He cites a massive survey conducted on Chicago's Skid Row between 1932 and 1940.
And we really have to contextualize those dates. This is the heart of the Great Depression, bleeding into the very early days of World War II mobilization.
Chicago was the ultimate hub back then. Railroads, slaughterhouses, heady industry. If you were a wandering man looking for work in the 1930s, you eventually ended up in Chicago.
So true. So what did the data reveal about why these men ended up on the row?
The statistics are revealing and, frankly, require careful interpretation. The survey asked thousands of men to identify the primary cause of their wandering. Drink is listed as the number one cause, accounting for 34.4%.
Which is high, sure, but look at what comes next.
Right. Unemployment is second at 19.3%. Mental instability accounts for 7.2%. But what is equally telling are the factors that rank at the bottom.
This is the best part.
Disposition is at 5.7%, and laziness is a mere 3.3%.
That completely shatters the stereotype of the lazy bum who just doesn't want to work. I mean, over 96% of these men are on the street for reasons other than laziness.
They are victims of a collapsed economy, untreated mental health crises, and severe addiction. Seath also looks at data regarding marital breakdown among these men during that same period.
And the causes for separation or divorce follow a similar pattern, right?
It's exactly. Drink leads massively at 37.7%, followed by finances at 15.1%, incompatibility at 8.7%,
Yeah.
and wife unfaithful at 6.1%.
What's fascinating here is how Seath insists that drink as a cause requires deeper investigation into why the person started drinking.
Yes, I found that to be a profoundly modern approach. He refuses to accept the symptom as the disease.
He insists on a root cause psychological analysis. He concludes that in the vast majority of these cases, alcoholism is merely the self-medication of a deeper primary factor.
Which he terms personality maladjustment.
Right. He defines this as an individual's inability to make the necessary psychological or social adjustments to the demands of school, family life, society, or the workplace.
So when the friction of trying to conform to a society they don't fit into becomes too great, they turn to drink to numb the friction.
And the drink eventually leads them to Skid Row. Demanding that mission workers look past the alcohol to treat the underlying maladjustment, well, it's incredibly clinical for a text rooted in evangelical theology.
It adds so much dignity to the process. And speaking of dignity, Seath spends time analyzing a specific demographic on Skid Row that he treats with immense respect. The migrant or transient seasonal worker?
Oh, yes. The men who built the country?
Literally.
Yeah.
These are the men who moved in defined migratory patterns, following the job as seasons changed. He points out that these transient men built the infrastructure of the American century. They laid the railroad tracks, they poured the concrete for the highways, they harvested the massive agricultural yields, and they felled the timber.
They were the muscle of industrial expansion, yet the paradox Seath highlights is tragic.
How so?
He notes that even in 1954, which was an era characterized by strong labor unions and significant improvements in working conditions for the settled middle class, these transient men were still forced to gather in the squalor of Skid Row during the off-season.
They built the infrastructure of the modern nation, but the nation built absolutely no infrastructure to house, heal, or support them when the harvest ended, or when the snow fell, or their bodies simply gave out from the brutal labor.
They were treated as disposable tools.
Which naturally leads me to a massive structural question. I am looking at this 1930s data, and I'm thinking about the historical timeline. The Great Depression hits, and the Roosevelt administration responds with the New Deal.
Right. Massive federal program.
You have the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the massive expansion of federal and state social safety nets. If the government is suddenly pouring millions into social welfare, why couldn't the secular state agencies or even the regular mainstream churches just absorb these transient men?
It's a great question.
Why did this highly specific parallel infrastructure of the rescue mission need to exist at all?
Seath anticipates that exact question, and his answer forms the core thesis of why rescue missions are a distinct entity. He systematically explains why both the organized mainstream church and the secular government apparatus were fundamentally unequipped to solve the problem of Skid Row.
Let's examine his critique of the organized church first. From a logistical standpoint, why can't a homeless, transient laborer simply walk into a beautiful Methodist or Presbyterian church on a Sunday morning and receive the holistic help he needs?
Well, Seath points out severe logistical and architectural barriers. The regular organized church simply does not possess the highly specialized staff or the physical equipment required for this specific demographic.
Because pastors are trained in theology, not addiction recovery.
Exactly. A traditional pastor is trained in homiletics, theology, and general pastoral care for families. They are not trained in clinical addiction recovery or the psychological triage of transient men.
And the buildings themselves are an issue, right?
Definitely. Church buildings are designed for worship, education, and fellowship. They do not have industrial fumigation chambers for lice-infested clothing. They do not have commercial soup kitchens capable of feeding hundreds daily. And they lack medical wards for men going through delirium tremens.
Beyond the logistics, Seath highlights a psychological barrier that I found deeply empathetic. He calls it the pride factor.
Yes, the shame of destitution.
He argues that even if you had a wealthy, polished congregation that was genuinely willing to welcome these men with open arms, the men of Skid Row would refuse to walk through the doors. The shame is too great.
They are acutely aware of their ragged clothes, their lack of hygiene, and the visible toll the street has taken on them.
The sheer contrast between their destitution and the polished environment of a middle-class congregation creates an insurmountable psychological wall.
Therefore, the rescue mission must exist to meet these men exactly where they are, geographically and psychologically, stripping away the social barriers of traditional Sunday worship.
And Seath uses a really poignant piece of poetry to articulate this relationship, doesn't he?
He does. He quotes, "The church has a hem to its garment, which reaches the very dust. It can cleanse the stains from the streets and lanes, and because it can, it must."
Ah, the hem of the garment.
Right. In his view, the rescue mission is not an alternative to the church. It is the specialized, rugged extension of it. It is the hem of the garment, doing the necessary, grueling work in the dust of the city streets.
That beautifully explains the church's limitation. But what about the secular government? By the 1950s, you have well-funded state employment offices, psychiatric hospitals, and municipal welfare departments. Why, in Seath's view, do they fail to eradicate Skid Row?
This brings us to the core theological and philosophical divide in Seath's worldview. He readily concedes that secular agencies do a fine job of providing the physical necessities. They can offer a clean bed, a hot meal, psychiatric evaluations, and job placement.
Right.
But he argues that they are fundamentally treating the symptoms while ignoring the ultimate disease. They miss what he calls the basic cause of the misery.
And what exactly is that basic cause in his framework?
In Seath's theological operating system, the basic cause of all human maladjustment, addiction, and wandering is sin. He is unequivocal on this point.
He doesn't mince words.
Not at all. He writes that secular sociologists can analyze it, survey it, disguise it, or attach high-sounding multisyllabic psychological terminology to it. But the root remains spiritual alienation from God.
Consequently, the only permanent cure is the spiritual regeneration found through the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Exactly. And by definition, a secular city or state agency cannot preach the gospel. They cannot offer spiritual salvation. Therefore, Seath argues that any secular rehabilitation program is bound to fail in the long run.
Because the state can repair the physical body, and the employment office can place the man in a job, but if the soul remains fractured, the internal engine driving the addiction is still running.
The man will inevitably end up back on Skid Row.
But beyond the theological argument, Seath also highlights a glaring practical limitation of secular agencies in the mid-century era, right?
He does. He notes that within the formal academic training of secular social workers at the time, there was virtually no specialized instruction on how to handle the unique pathology of the homeless transient man.
So they were basically flying blind.
Yeah, the secular bureaucracy was designed for settled families experiencing temporary hardship, not for the nomadic, deeply traumatized population of Skid Row.
He paints a picture of a government apparatus that is simply overwhelmed by this specific demographic. He explicitly states that governmental agencies have tried to handle this situation, realized they lacked the specialized expertise and the patience for the endless cycle of relapse, and literally given the job back to the missions.
The state threw its hands up and outsourced the most difficult cases to the religious sector.
And because this immense responsibility was thrust back upon them, the rescue missions could not remain static. They found themselves dealing with a massive, evolving crisis, which forced them to adapt their care models rapidly.
The evolution of who was actually standing in the soup line is fascinating. The text outlines a clear chronological shift in the demographics of Skid Row.
Right, because it wasn't always the same group of people.
Exactly. In the late 19th and very early 20th century, the clientele of the rescue mission was almost exclusively male. Mostly severe alcoholics, transient laborers, and men who had hit absolute rock bottom.
The mission was essentially a men's club of the destitute.
But as the decades progressed, the perimeter of suffering expanded. Seath documents how women of the street began seeking refuge at the missions.
And as urban decay shifted neighborhood boundaries, missions suddenly found children roaming the streets outside their doors, largely unsupervised while their parents scrambled for work.
The missions had to pivot. They started opening Sunday schools and recreation centers simply to keep the children out of danger.
But the true catalyst for systemic evolution was the Great Depression of the 1930s. Suddenly, the line outside the mission wasn't just filled with transient men, it was filled with entire families.
Fathers, mothers, and children who had lost their homes and lacked the proper clothing to attend their regular community churches. They turned to the nearest inner-city mission for sheer survival.
The operational focus had to violently shift from simply sobering up drunkards to managing comprehensive family welfare.
And this demographic explosion required a massive upgrade in physical infrastructure. In the early pioneer days of the movement, the setup was bare bones. You rented a cheap storefront, slapped up a sign that said Gospel Hall, put out some folding chairs, brewed a massive vat of soup, and provided a few cots.
The operational motto was soap, soup, and salvation.
Right, and for a purely transient male population, that was somewhat sufficient. But you cannot apply that model to a starving family or an expectant mother.
No, you definitely can't. The missions had to become highly complex logistical operations. To accommodate the new reality, they began opening specialized girls' dormitories. They established fully staffed maternity wards in the inner city.
They even purchased land outside the city to organize summer camps so that thousands of children trapped in suffocating tenement housing could experience fresh air and adequate nutrition for a few weeks a year.
They added clinical hospital units and dedicated alcoholic wards. The sheer scale of the physical aid became staggering.
And this rapid, massive expansion of physical infrastructure brings us right back to the potato sack story we opened with.
Ah, yes. The doomed church.
Seath watches missions transform into hospitals, employment agencies, and grocery distribution centers, and he issues a profound existential warning. He fears the mission will lose its core identity.
The story perfectly encapsulates the trap. The superintendent of that doomed mission had an earnest, desperately compassionate desire to help starving families. He filled the chapel with potatoes because the physical need was so immediate and overwhelming.
But in doing so, he physically and metaphorically buried the altar.
Exactly. When the staff said, "We don't have time to conduct meetings, we're too busy feeding people," they had severed the soul of the mission from its body.
Seath's conclusion about that mission, that it's soon closed and has never reopened, is meant to be a chilling reality check for anyone engaged in social work. To Seath, the mission must never forget the dual nature of Christ's example. He had a ministry of healing, but he also had a message of salvation.
They are inextricably linked, but the hierarchy must remain intact. Everything done in the realm of physical aid, the fumigation, the medical care, the summer camps, the potatoes, is merely a vehicle.
It is a means to an end designed to stabilize the individual enough so they can hear and receive the spiritual message.
He writes this directive in all capital letters to ensure it cannot be missed. The spiritual must always be preeminent.
The ultimate metric of success for a mission isn't how many beds were filled or how many meals were served. The ultimate test is, are souls being saved?
Which introduces a highly complex operational challenge. If the spiritual message is the preeminent goal, how do you successfully deliver that message to a man whose brain is clouded by alcohol, whose body is ravaged by the elements, and whose trust in humanity is completely shattered?
How do you counsel the deeply traumatized?
Exactly. Seath dedicates a vital section of his study to this exact how-to, framing it around the concept of personal counseling. Interestingly, he points his workers straight to the New Testament, conceptualizing Jesus Christ as the master psychologist.
Right. He argues that studying how Jesus navigated interpersonal dynamics with marginalized people provides a better clinical framework for counseling than contemporary textbooks.
He anchors this in what he terms the psychogenic principle. The goal of counseling isn't just to scold someone into better behavior. It is to gently guide the individual's mind back to a psychological state where they previously experienced stability, goodness, or a relationship with God.
And Seath emphatically reminds his workers that the transient man sleeping under a bridge possesses psychological complexes, traumas, and defense mechanisms just as intricate and difficult to unravel as those of a millionaire paying for a Park Avenue psychoanalyst.
They require highly skilled, deeply personal intervention. To equip his workers, Seath lays out 6 specific rules for personal counseling. Reviewing them today, they read like a foundational syllabus for a modern clinical social work degree.
They really do.
The first rule is deceptively simple. Learn how to listen.
Yeah.
A man who has been ignored by society for a decade definitely needs to be heard before he needs to be lectured.
The second rule is be objective. This is incredibly difficult in practice. Seath warns workers not to allow personal prejudice, disgust, or preconceived moral judgments to influence their interaction.
Right. When a man sits across from you smelling of cheap liquor and hasn't bathed in weeks, the human instinct is to judge.
The counselor must suppress that and view the man objectively as a patient needing care.
Rule number 3, hold confidences dear. If a transient woman trusts you enough to reveal the deep family trauma or the abuse that led her to the street, that information must be treated with the utmost sanctity. It is not gossip. It's a clinical secret.
Rule 4, know about resources in the community. The mission worker must be a master networker, knowing exactly who to call for specific medical, legal, or psychiatric help.
However, Seath insists this must only be done with the explicit consent of the client, preserving their autonomy.
The 5th rule is about cognitive organization. Try to help your client get things in the right order. A person in deep crisis is overwhelmed by the chaos of their life. Debts, broken relationships, addiction, legal trouble.
The counselor's job is to help them untangle the knot, prioritizing what must be handled today versus what could be addressed next month.
And finally, the sixth rule, which requires immense skill. Use tact, but do not hesitate to bring folks to the place where they realize their need to face the truth.
Face the truth is the turning point. You can't enable the delusion that their drinking isn't destroying them. You have to guide them to that harsh realization, gently but firmly.
But personal one-on-one counseling behind closed doors is only half of the mission's spiritual machinery. The public delivery of the gospel is equally vital.
Seath describes the gospel service as the beating heart that pumps the lifeblood through the entire vast system of the mission. If the preaching stops, the mission dies.
And knowing the fragile state of his audience, Seath provides instructions for these evening services that border on theatrical stage direction. He is acutely aware of the physical and emotional exhaustion of the men sitting in the pews.
He explicitly commands his preachers, do not talk down at the men, talk with them.
His linguistic instructions are fascinating. He forbids the use of derogatory slang from the pulpit. He says, do not use terms like skid row, flophouse, bum, or hobo.
That vocabulary belongs to the streets, not to the sanctuary. It is a deliberate tactic to temporarily elevate the men out of their environment and restore a measure of their dignity.
He also gives a brilliant directive on tone. Don't rain fire and brimstone all over them. They know they are sinners.
That displays a profound level of empathy. A man who's been beaten by police, robbed by other transients, and is currently experiencing the physical agony of alcohol withdrawal does not need a preacher screaming at him about the fires of hell. He is already living in hell.
Seath demands that the preaching focus entirely on a positive gospel of hope, restoration, and the unyielding love of God.
And crucially, he says to keep it brief, he paints a vivid picture. By the time these men have stood in line, been fed, forced to bathe, and had their clothes fumigated, it is late in the evening. As Seath notes, they are old, crippled, and weary.
He tells the worship leaders not to make the men stand up more than once to sing a hymn. It is a deeply compassionate acknowledgement that the spirit might be willing, but the physical flesh is utterly exhausted.
This attention to the psychological state of the audience extends even to how they distributed printed materials. Tract distribution was a massive part of evangelical outreach, but Seath approached it with the eye of a 1950s advertising executive.
He gives strict rules on the graphic design and material quality of the pamphlets. He insists on using high-quality paper and clear, legible type.
Knowing that many of the men have poor eyesight and no access to reading glasses.
He also dictates the content. Do not cram the page with tiny printing or dense, heavy theological doctrine. Use simple language that a person with no religious background can grasp immediately.
Avoid sensationalist imagery. The goal is to provide a clear, readable message of hope that a man can fold into his pocket and read later when he is sober. They were engineering their literature to penetrate the specific cognitive fog of Skid Row.
So we have explored the theology, the counseling psychology, and the preaching methodology. But how did these concepts manifest in brick and mortar?
The text makes it clear that Skid Row is not a monolith, and therefore the architectural and operational design of the missions had to vary wildly. Seath outlines a comprehensive taxonomy of rescue missions, categorizing them by their specific function and inherent risks.
Let's examine this taxonomy. The entry-level model is the straight gospel mission.
This is the leanest, most agile operation. It's typically just a rented storefront or a small hall where daily evangelistic services are held. They don't have the infrastructure to house or feed men on site.
Instead, they might hand out physical tickets that a man can redeem at a nearby commercial diner or a separate lodging house for a meal and a bed.
The logistical advantage of the straight gospel model is its low barrier to entry. It requires minimal capital investment, the overhead is low, and if the demographic center of Skid Row shifts a few blocks down, the mission can easily break their leads and move with the population.
However, Seath views this model with significant apprehension. He argues that it fails to provide the holistic wraparound care necessary for true rehabilitation.
The danger is that it allows well-meaning but untrained religious volunteers to feel like they're doing mission work while merely running a superficial, highly fragmented program that leaves the men back on the street for 23 hours a day.
The next step up in complexity is the lodging house and meals mission, which Seath notes was the most prevalent type in the 1950s. This model incorporates physical care directly into the building.
They provide free beds and soup for the destitute, but crucially, they also operate as a commercial enterprise.
Right. They sell better beds, private rooms, and larger meals to men who have a little money, perhaps from a day labor job. This revenue makes the mission partially self-supporting.
But this financial model introduces a massive operational hazard. The superintendent must constantly fight the economic gravity of the enterprise. If the leadership becomes too focused on balancing the books and filling the paying beds, the spiritual mission evaporates.
Seath warns that without rigorous spiritual discipline, this type of mission quickly degenerates into nothing more than a cheap, secular flophouse that happens to have a cross on the door.
The third category is one that absolutely fascinated me, as it mirrors so much of our modern conversation around sustainability and social enterprise. It is the industrial mission, often operating as a sheltered workshop.
The origin story of this model is pure logistical genius.
As these missions grew in prominence, the public began treating them as dumping grounds, donating literal tons of random, junk-broken furniture, torn clothing, old appliances. Simultaneously, the missions had a lobby full of men who were aged, mildly handicapped, or unemployable in the fast-paced post-war economy.
They had a surplus of broken goods and a surplus of broken men, so they combined them.
They engineered massive occupational therapy departments. Instead of just throwing the donated junk away, they put the men to work sorting, cleaning, repairing, and refurbishing the goods.
The men repaired the furniture, the missions sold the restored items in thrift stores, and the revenue funded the mission's rehabilitation programs.
But the true genius was the psychological mechanism at play. By engaging in structured, dignified labor, the men began to rebuild their own shattered self-respect. They were learning new trades, reestablishing a work ethic, and proving to themselves that they still had value.
Seath beautifully roots this industrial upcycling in a biblical directive, quoting Christ after the feeding of the 5,000. Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost.
The mission was gathering the fragmented refuse of an industrial society and the fragmented lives of marginalized men, and methodically restoring both. It's an incredibly elegant, closed-loop system.
Moving beyond the male demographic, Seath details women's and children's work. As we noted earlier, the demographic shifted, but Seath states plainly that it is logistically and morally disastrous to attempt to house vulnerable women and children in the same building as transient men deep inside the toxic environment of Skid Row.
Therefore, successful missions establish completely separate facilities, often miles away from the main headquarters.
He highlights regional adaptations, noting that specialized maternity homes for unwed mothers were particularly prevalent and well-operated in the southern states.
For children, he points to massive, proactive youth outreach programs designed to intercept kids before they ever reached Skid Row.
He specifically praises the Ober Club, operated by the St. Paul, Minnesota Union Gospel Mission, declaring it virtually unequaled in the nation as a boys' club dedicated to preventing juvenile delinquency through structured recreation and spiritual guidance.
Similarly, there is family work, which often evolved into neighborhood missions. This is a fascinating phenomenon of urban flight.
Right. As wealthy, established congregations fled the decaying inner city for the booming post-war suburbs, they left behind massive, beautiful church buildings.
The rescue missions would often acquire these abandoned architectural husks and repurpose them. They transformed them into hubs for family relief, employment services, and medical aid, specifically targeting struggling neighborhood families who felt too ashamed or impoverished to commute to a wealthy suburban church.
In addition to these standard models, Seath outlines special programs that demonstrate incredible, almost utopian innovation. For example, mission farms.
He highlights the Union City Mission of Minneapolis, which operated a sprawling facility at Medicine Lake. This was not a small garden plot. It was a massive campus featuring a 248-bed hospital, a dedicated home for men, and a huge Bible conference program, all situated in a rural agricultural setting.
The therapeutic mechanism here is environmental extraction. You cannot heal a man's lungs while he is still trapped in a coal mine.
The farm physically removed the men from the predatory, toxic environment of the city streets, placing them in fresh air where agricultural labor and physical health could be prioritized.
And perhaps the most culturally significant special program detailed in the text is the alcoholic ward. Seath identifies this as the absolute newest development in the rescue mission arsenal, pioneered by the Haven of Rest mission in Akron, Ohio.
The location is deeply poetic, as Akron is also the birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous.
The implementation of the alcoholic ward represents a massive paradigm shift. They were actively medicalizing the treatment of severe addiction within an evangelical context.
They were no longer simply telling a man going through violent withdrawals to just pray harder. They were constructing dedicated medical wards equipped with clinical tools and staffed by licensed nurses and doctors.
They acknowledged that addiction had a terrifying physical component that required clinical intervention before the spiritual component could be addressed. Seath accurately predicted that within a few years, these medicalized alcoholic wards would become a mandatory feature in the majority of major rescue missions.
They were successfully merging clinical medicine with gospel intervention.
So we have spent an enormous amount of time examining the history, the sociological data, the counseling theory, and the architectural taxonomy of these missions. But theory is cheap. Does this incredibly complex system actually work?
To prove his concept, Seath provides detailed, anonymized case histories. Let's look at the human element and walk through 4 contrasting profiles to see how the theory was applied in practice.
The first case is a 30-year-old cook. He was born in Washington to a severely impoverished family. He had only 2 years of high school education. His employment record was listed as fair but spasmodic.
His presence on Skid Row was attributed to a deeply unfortunate family background that spiraled into juvenile delinquency. The psychological root of his wandering was a profound, paralyzing conviction that no one cared whether he lived or died.
For this young man, the mission did not prescribe heavy medical intervention or complex psychiatric unwinding. The entire therapeutic program was focused on systematically disproving his core belief.
The mission staff focused on supplying relentless, unconditional friendship to overcome his intense loneliness. They essentially manufactured a surrogate family.
By proving that someone did care, they awakened a dormant desire within him for successful living, and they utilized their industrial programs to cross-train him for a different type of work.
The timeline is critical here. It took 2 full years of sustained effort within the mission's ecosystem, but the result was a complete rewiring of his trajectory.
He didn't just survive, he thrived, eventually becoming an assistant superintendent in a community center. They intercepted a cycle of generational delinquency simply by weaponizing sustained friendship.
The second case provides a stark contrast in background. This is 54-year-old hotel clerk from Iowa. He had an excellent family background and was highly educated for the era, possessing a high school diploma plus 6 months of specialized business college.
However, his employment record was poor, summarized by the tragic note. A good employee if he would stay sober.
The root cause of his destitution was identified as chronic alcoholism, but the deeper psychological diagnosis was a crippling inferiority complex. He drank to silence the internal voice telling him he was a failure.
The missions program for him was multifaceted. First, the spiritual intervention to break the immediate chain of the liquor habit. But the secondary, practical intervention was utilizing his existing intellect.
They spent 17 months retraining him, updating his skills for the modern hotel industry, and methodically teaching him the value of accepting and holding responsibility.
The outcome for the clerk was spectacular. After nearly a year and a half of intensive rehabilitation, he was reunited with his estranged wife. He secured steady employment, eventually becoming the manager of an entire chain of hotels.
He purchased his own home and returned to the mission frequently as a regular financial contributor. They cured the inferiority complex by proving his competence.
The third case highlights the immense flexibility required of a mission. This involves a 61-year-old woodworker from Kentucky. He possessed a solid background, an 8th-grade education, which was standard for his generation, and an impeccable lifelong employment record.
He was not an alcoholic, he was not a delinquent, and he did not possess a complex neurosis. The only reason he found himself destitute on Skid Row was structural unemployment due to his advanced age, compounded by the fact that his children were financially incapable of supporting him.
He had simply aged out of the brutal manual labor market.
This man didn't need his psyche rebuilt. He needed to survive the gap. The mission recognized this and adjusted their program accordingly. The goal was simply to carry him while preserving his dignity.
They furnished him with light, meaningful woodworking tasks within the mission's industrial department. This wasn't to train him for a new career, but to maintain his vital self-respect until his federal old age pension paperwork was processed and the checks began to arrive.
After 4 years of this supportive holding pattern, he transitioned out, living happily off his pension and visiting the mission weekly for fellowship. They provided a dignified bridge over an economic chasm.
The final case history involves a divorced man. He originally had a family and a stable life, but due to unspecified pressures, he abandoned his home and descended into the transient life of Skid Row.
While he was wandering, his wife legally secured a divorce. When he eventually learned of this, the finality of the divorce was a tremendous psychological shock that shattered his remaining defenses.
The mission's diagnosis here was a fundamental failure to understand and accept adult responsibility. Their program for him was a masterclass in graduated trust.
After he surrendered his life to Christ, establishing the spiritual baseline, they began promoting him to various work assignments within the mission. They gave him leadership roles over smaller internal organizations.
However, the case notes specify a crucial detail. They deliberately kept him away from handling any mission finances. They were teaching him responsibility by giving him responsibility, but keeping the guardrails up to prevent a catastrophic failure.
That is the essence of clinical rehabilitation, stretching the patient just to the edge of their capability without letting them snap. Over time, he internalized this responsibility.
He secured employment outside the mission as a manual laborer, steadily rebuilt his life, and eventually remarried. He acquired a fine home, a car, and a highly respected position in his community.
Synthesizing these four dramatically different lives, the true genius of Seath's methodology becomes apparent. The overarching program was always spiritually monolithic. Win them to Christ first. That was the non-negotiable foundation.
But the practical application built upon that foundation was incredibly bespoke. For the young cook, the intervention was surrogate family. For the hotel clerk, it was intellectual retraining.
For the elderly woodworker, it was dignified life support. For the divorced man, it was graduated responsibility. The theology was unyielding, but the clinical sociology was infinitely flexible.
It is a remarkable system for putting out fires and rescuing individuals from the flames of Skid Row, but Seath was deeply troubled by the fact that the fires kept starting.
He recognized that rescuing people at the bottom of the waterfall is ultimately a losing battle if you don't address who is throwing them in at the top. He wanted to stop the flow of broken humanity. What was his ultimate systemic solution?
Seath steps back and identifies three foundational institutions in American society. He calls them the three pillars of responsibility. He argues that Skid Row only exists because one or all of these pillars have structurally failed the individual. The first and most critical pillar is the home.
To emphasize the crisis within the American home, Seath drops a statistical bombshell sourced from the 1952 Third Annual Christian Social Work Conference held at Wheaton College.
The research presented there revealed that 80% of juvenile delinquents were coming from homes with better than average incomes.
Furthermore, the researchers concluded that 90% of juvenile delinquency was a direct result of the parents' delinquency in one form or another.
That statistic is meant to shock a 1950s audience that equated poverty with immorality and wealth with virtue. Seath is pointing a finger directly at the affluent post-war American suburbs.
He argues that while broken, impoverished homes certainly contribute to the problem, the deeper rot is happening in materially wealthy homes that lack any spiritual core.
He blames parents who treat the things of God as merely a polite social custom, failing to anchor their children in a definite personal faith. When a crisis hits, those children have no internal compass, and despite their wealthy backgrounds, they eventually drift toward the row.
The second failing pillar, according to Seath, is the school. He is careful to state that he's not anti-intellectual. He firmly believes every child is entitled to the maximum education possible.
However, he levels a harsh critique at the purely secular educational system. He argues that teaching a child mathematics and literature without providing a moral and spiritual framework does not adequately prepare them for the crushing realities, trials, and temptations of adult life.
He goes so far as to claim that an education that deliberately excludes Christ is the most dangerous thing in the world, as it arms the intellect while leaving the soul defenseless.
The third pillar, and perhaps the one he critiques most fiercely, is his own institution, the church. Seath points out a tragic irony. Many of the most broken men dying on Skid Row had extensive church backgrounds.
They attended Sunday school as children. They knew the historical facts about God, and they knew the stories about the Bible, but they had never been guided into a transformative personal relationship with it.
He calls for a radical return to aggressive gospel preaching, warning the organized church to stop treating Sunday school as a polite amateur hour and start treating it as the frontline defense against human ruin.
But Seath is also a realist. He knows that reforming the American home, school, and church will take generations, and in the meantime, the cities are currently drowning in the crisis of Skid Row.
For municipalities facing massive, entrenched transient populations, Seath pitches an incredibly ambitious, almost utopian infrastructure project. He calls it the men's town concept.
Let's really analyze the blueprints of this men's town, because it sounds like something a modern progressive think tank would propose today.
Seath envisions a massive, sprawling farm campus located far outside the city limits. This campus would be systematically divided into 3 distinct operational units.
One unit dedicated solely to young, first-time offenders or transients. A second, highly medicalized unit dedicated to severe alcoholics. And a third, accessible unit designed for the crippled, the aged, and the permanently handicapped.
The intake mechanism is what makes this concept so revolutionary. Men would arrive at Men's Town via referrals from city agencies, police departments, or inner-city missions.
But crucially, Men's Town would not be a prison. It would not be a penal colony where men were legally sentenced to hard labor. Admission would be entirely voluntary.
The catch is that to enter, a man would have to sign a social contract agreeing to remain on the campus for a minimum of 6 months to a year. Seath understood that you cannot undo a decade of trauma and addiction with a 2-week program. Rehabilitation requires time and environmental stability.
And the ecosystem within this campus is breathtakingly holistic. It wouldn't just be a place to sleep. Seath outlines a comprehensive program that includes rigorous occupational therapy, structured recreation, full-time medical and psychiatric services, deep dive case investigations into a man's background, and intense personal counseling.
Acknowledging the diversity of the population, he even mandates that religious services be conducted by both Protestant and Catholic chaplains.
The exit strategy is equally well planned. The campus would feature an integrated employment service. The fatal flaw of many rehabilitation programs is releasing a newly sober man straight back onto the corner of Skid Row where his addiction started.
Men's Town would bypass the inner city entirely, placing rehabilitated men into jobs in smaller, stable, outlying communities, completely severing their geographical tie to their past trauma.
Reading the Men's Town proposal, I am struck by how it anticipates the modern debate between housing-first initiatives and treatment-first models. Seath is essentially proposing a massive, comprehensive treatment-first campus.
He acknowledges that this vision is so logistically complex and financially exorbitant that no single private agency or mission could ever fund it alone. It would require an unprecedented alliance of municipal funding, private philanthropy, and religious operation.
To execute a vision of that magnitude, or indeed to successfully operate even a small storefront mission, Seath emphasizes one final, non-negotiable requirement: trained leadership.
The era of the well-meaning but bumbling amateur is over. The complexities of mid-century urban poverty are too severe.
He demands that mission superintendents view their role as a highly technical profession. They need formal training in clinical psychology to understand the men, training in public relations to navigate City Hall, and rigorous training in corporate finance to keep the massive operations solvent.
A bleeding heart is no longer sufficient. It must be paired with an educated mind.
Yet, true to his foundational philosophy, Seath insists that all the clinical training and financial acumen in the world is useless if it is not animated by a genuine, consuming spiritual passion.
He states bluntly that there is only one valid reason anyone should enter the grueling, heartbreaking field of rescue mission work: because they feel a divine compulsion and simply cannot stay out of it.
To bind this diverse army of interdenominational, highly trained workers together, he offers a beautifully simple theological manifesto. He states the ultimate operating principle of the mission as no creed but Christ, no law but love.
No law but love. What a profoundly challenging standard to set for an institution dealing with the most difficult elements of human society.
To summarize the vast scope of Seath's 1954 study, he views the rescue mission not as a band-aid, but as the ultimate rugged extension of the church.
The church in action in the darkest, most difficult areas of the city where traditional institutions have retreated or failed.
Operating this machinery requires immense logistical flexibility, a deep clinical understanding of human trauma and psychology, and an absolutely unwavering, preeminent focus on spiritual transformation.
It's an incredible framework.
This has been an incredibly enlightening journey into the trenches of 1954 urban social work. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over, bringing Seath's warnings right into our present reality.
Remember the story of the church buried under the sacks of potatoes.
Yes, Seath warned that the moment an institution becomes so obsessed with the logistics of physical aid that it forgets the deeper purpose of human restoration, it loses its soul and begins to die.
In our modern era, massive secular government agencies, multi-billion-dollar state budgets, and gigantic corporate nonprofits handle the vast majority of our food distribution, housing initiatives, and psychiatric care. We have built bureaucracies Seath couldn't have imagined.
So what is the potato sack trap of today? Are our highly funded, meticulously metrics-driven modern systems actually treating the deepest, agonizing roots of human isolation, trauma, and lack of spiritual purpose? Or, with all of our advanced technology, our sprawling government apparatus, and our endless bureaucratic red tape, are we ultimately just handing out better, more expensive potatoes?
That is the ultimate existential question that every modern social safety net must critically examine.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history, the psychology, and the theology of the American Rescue Mission. We'll see you next time.